Welcome to today's episode, where we journey into one of history's darkest chapters, the systematic reign of terror that transformed the Soviet Union into a police state under Joseph Stalin. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. in Moscow, 1937. A family sleeps peacefully until heavy boots thunder up the stairs. The dreaded midnight knock echoes through their apartment. Within minutes, a father, a mother, sometimes entire families, vanish into the night, swallowed by a machine of terror so efficient that neighbors learn to sleep with one ear open, listening for those footsteps that might come for them next. How did one man transform an entire nation into a prison? How did Stalin, a Georgian revolutionary who never commanded an army or led a popular uprising, manage to hold 200 million people in the grip of absolute fear for nearly 3 decades? This is the story of how terror became government policy, how paranoia became patriotism, and how an entire civilization learned to live in the shadow of the midnight knock. Over the next hour, we'll trace Stalin's methodical construction of a fear-based empire that reached into every home, every workplace, every whispered conversation. From his cunning rise to power to the massive purges that consumed millions, from the artificial famines that starved entire regions to the show trials that turned justice into theater, we'll explore how Stalin weaponized fear itself to forge one of history's most ruthless dictatorships. Chapter 1. The Rise of a Gray Blur. The funeral of Vladimir Lenin in January 1924 draws massive crowds to Red Square, but one man deliberately stays in the background. While other Bolshevik leaders jostle for position and deliver grand speeches, Joseph Stalin quietly orchestrates the ceremony, presenting himself as Lenin's humble disciple. Few recognize that this unassuming Georgian is already positioning himself to inherit the revolution. Stalin's path to absolute power begins not with dramatic coups or stirring speeches, but through bureaucratic cunning and patient manipulation. As General Secretary of the Communist Party since 1922, he controls the levers of patronage and information that will prove far more valuable than revolutionary heroics. While his rivals, the brilliant Leon Trotsky, the popular Nikolai Bukharin, the veteran Grigory Zinoviev, engage in ideological debates about the future of socialism, Stalin quietly builds a network of loyal administrators who owe their positions to him. His first target is Leon Trotsky, the charismatic architect of the Red Army's victory in the Civil War. Stalin exploits Trotsky's arrogance and his Jewish identity, painting him as an outsider to the Russian revolutionary tradition. When Trotsky challenges Stalin's interpretation of Lenin's testament, a document warning against Stalin's accumulation of power, Stalin's allies in the party apparatus ensure the warning is buried. By 1925, Trotsky finds himself isolated, his influence waning as Stalin's supporters dominate key committees. But Stalin's genius lies not just in eliminating rivals, but in using their elimination to establish precedents for future terror. Each purge of party leadership normalizes the idea that even the most dedicated Bolsheviks can become enemies of the state. When Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev briefly ally with Trotsky against Stalin, they unwittingly provide him with the justification to label opposition as factionalism, a crime against party unity. The expulsion of Trotsky from the Soviet Union in 1929 marks more than the end of Stalin's last major rival. It signals the beginning of a new phase where dissent itself becomes treasonous. Party members who once debated policy freely now watch their words, knowing that yesterday's comrade could become tomorrow's enemy of the people. Stalin has learned that fear works best when it operates through uncertainty, when no one knows where the lines are drawn or when they might shift. By 1929, Stalin controls not just the party apparatus, but the narrative of the revolution itself. History is rewritten to minimize his rivals' contributions and magnify his own role as Lenin's chosen successor. Photographs are altered, documents disappear, and witnesses to inconvenient truths find themselves reassigned to distant posts or worse. The man once dismissed by colleagues as a gray blur has systematically eliminated every other color from the Soviet political spectrum. This methodical approach to power, patient, bureaucratic, and utterly ruthless, establishes the template for everything that follows. Stalin has learned that terror works best when it appears systematic rather than arbitrary, when it flows through established channels rather than obvious violence. The bureaucracy of fear is being born, and soon it will consume the entire Soviet Union. Chapter 2. The Machinery of Terror. The year 1930 marks a turning point as Stalin transforms the Soviet secret police from a revolutionary instrument into the primary tool of social control. The OGPU, soon to become the NKVD, evolves from hunting counter-revolutionaries to manufacturing them on an industrial scale. Under Stalin's direction, the secret police develops techniques that will terrorize the Soviet Union for decades. The genius of Stalin's terror apparatus lies in its bureaucratic efficiency. Arrest quotas are established for every region, creating a systematic approach to repression that operates like a grotesque assembly line. Local NKVD chiefs receive orders to arrest specific numbers of kulaks, wreckers, or enemies of the people, categories so vague that virtually anyone can be swept up in the machinery. A peasant who complains about grain requisitions becomes a kulak. An engineer whose factory fails to meet production targets becomes a wrecker. A party member who questions policy becomes a traitor. The interrogation process itself becomes a science of psychological destruction. NKVD operatives perfect techniques of sleep deprivation, prolonged questioning, and threats against family members that break even the most resolute prisoners. The goal is not just confession, but elaborate testimonies implicating others, creating an ever-expanding web of alleged conspiracy. Each arrest generates new names, new targets, ensuring the machine never runs out of fuel. Genrik Yagoda, the head of the NKVD, oversees the construction of a vast network of prisons, transit camps, and labor installations that will become known as the Gulag. But Stalin's innovation goes beyond simple imprisonment. He creates a system where terror serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It eliminates potential opposition, provides slave labor for industrialization, and most importantly, keeps the entire population in a state of anxious compliance. The show trials, beginning in 1928, introduce a new dimension to Soviet terror: public spectacle. When Stalin needs to explain economic failures or social problems, he produces elaborate theatrical events where prominent figures confess to fantastic crimes against the state. The trial of the so-called Industrial Party in 1930 establishes the template. Respected engineers and specialists are tortured into confessing they sabotaged Soviet industry on behalf of foreign powers. These performances serve multiple functions in Stalin's terror system. They provide scapegoats for the regime's failures, demonstrate the futility of resistance, and normalize the idea that anyone, no matter how apparently loyal, might secretly be a traitor. Citizens watching these trials learn that survival depends not on actual innocence, but on avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as suspicious. The psychological impact of Stalin's terror extends far beyond its direct victims. Families learn to inform on each other rather than risk being accused of harboring enemies. Children are taught to report their parents' incorrect conversations to authorities. Trust dissolves as the foundation of social relationships, replaced by a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion where safety lies in isolation and silence. By 1932, Stalin has created something unprecedented in human history: a terror apparatus that operates as efficiently as any other government ministry, complete with production targets, performance reviews, and bureaucratic procedures for the destruction of human lives. The machinery is now in place for the horrors that will follow, and Stalin is ready to feed it with ever greater numbers of victims. Chapter 3. starving the peasants into submission. The Ukrainian countryside in 1932 presents a scene from hell itself. Entire villages lie silent, their inhabitants dead or dying from starvation. Bodies litter roads where desperate families collapsed while fleeing their homes. Yet this is no natural disaster. This is the Holodomor, Stalin's deliberately engineered famine designed to crush Ukrainian nationalism and force collectivization through terror and starvation. Stalin's war against the peasantry begins with collectivization, officially launched in 1929 as a path to agricultural modernization. In reality, it represents the most radical social transformation in human history, aimed at destroying traditional rural life and replacing it with state-controlled collective farms. When peasants resist surrendering their land, livestock, and grain to collective ownership, Stalin's response escalates to genocide. The dekulakization campaign provides the pretext for unprecedented brutality. The term kulak, originally meaning a prosperous peasant, expands to include anyone who opposes collectivization. Entire families are loaded onto cattle cars and transported to remote regions of Siberia or Central Asia, where they face starvation, exposure, and death. Conservative estimates suggest that over 2 million peasants died during deportation, but many historians believe the true number is far higher. Those who remain face a different form of destruction. Stalin's agents implement grain requisition policies so severe that seed grain and emergency reserves are seized, ensuring that no food remains for the producers themselves. When Communist Party activists arrive in villages with armed guards, they conduct house-to-house searches, confiscating not just grain but potatoes, vegetables, and even fishing nets that might provide alternative food sources. The horror reaches its peak in Ukraine, where Stalin combines economic terror with ethnic targeting. Ukrainian peasants are forbidden from leaving their villages, creating vast outdoor prisons where millions slowly starve to death. Soviet law makes it illegal to give bread to starving peasants, turning acts of basic human compassion into crimes against the state. Guards are posted at railway stations to prevent desperate families from fleeing to cities where food might be available. Pavlik Morozov becomes the regime's symbol of proper socialist behavior when he allegedly informs on his father for hiding grain. Whether this 13-year-old boy actually existed or was a propaganda creation matters less than the message. Even family loyalty must yield to devotion to Stalin and the state. Children who betray their parents are celebrated as heroes, while those who protect their families face deportation or death. The international community largely ignores or denies the famine's existence. Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, wins a Pulitzer Prize for reporting that describes Soviet agricultural policy as a success while millions die. Stalin's propaganda apparatus successfully portrays the famine as either Western lies or the necessary cost of modernization, ensuring that little international pressure develops to stop the slaughter. By 1934, when the famine finally ends, between 4 and 7 million people have died. The exact number will never be known, because Stalin's regime destroys records and prohibits discussion of the catastrophe. But the political objective is achieved. Rural resistance to Soviet power is broken forever. The surviving peasants understand that opposition to Stalin's will means not just personal death, but the potential extermination of entire communities. The Holodomor establishes a crucial precedent in Stalin's rule. Mass death is acceptable if it serves political purposes. The deliberate starvation of millions demonstrates that Stalin will sacrifice any number of lives to maintain power, setting the stage for even greater horrors to come. The countryside has been terrorized into submission, and Stalin now turns his attention to the cities. Chapter 4. The Great Purge begins the assassination of Sergei Kirov on December 1, 1934. Provides Stalin with the perfect pretext to unleash terror against his own party. Kirov, the popular Leningrad party boss, dies from a gunshot wound in a corridor of the Smolny Institute. killed by a deranged Communist Party member named Leonid Nikolov. But Stalin immediately declares the murder part of a vast conspiracy against Soviet power, launching an investigation that will consume the Communist Party itself. Within hours of Kirov's death, Stalin personally travels to Leningrad to oversee the investigation, but his actions suggest less interest in finding the truth than in exploiting the opportunity. New laws are rushed into effect, allowing for accelerated trials and immediate executions of terrorists. Definition of terrorism expands to include virtually any form of opposition to the regime, creating legal frameworks for the mass persecution that follows. The first wave of arrests targets alleged conspirators in Kirov's assassination, but the investigation quickly expands beyond any plausible connection to the actual murder. Former oppositionists who have already been defeated and marginalized find themselves arrested on charges of planning Stalin's assassination. Zinoviev and Kamenev, Stalin's former allies turned rivals, are brought from prison to face new accusations of orchestrating terrorist plots despite having been under constant surveillance. Stalin's handling of the Kirov case reveals his sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate fear for political advantage. Rather than simply eliminating his enemies quietly, he creates a public narrative of conspiracy and betrayal that justifies increasingly severe measures. Each arrest produces new confessions implicating additional victims, creating an ever-expanding web of alleged treason that can encompass anyone Stalin chooses to destroy. The psychological pressure on Communist Party members becomes unbearable as the investigation spreads. Officials who thought their revolutionary credentials protected them discovered that past service means nothing if Stalin decides they pose a threat. Party meetings become exercises in denunciation as members compete to demonstrate their loyalty by identifying suspicious behavior among their colleagues. Genrikh Yagoda, still head of the NKVD, oversees the expansion of the security apparatus to handle the increasing caseload. New prisons are constructed, interrogation techniques are refined, and the bureaucracy of repression grows exponentially. But Stalin already suspects that Yagoda lacks the ruthlessness necessary for what he plans next, setting the stage for changes in leadership that will intensify the terror. The year 1935 witnesses the systematic destruction of the Leningrad Party organization as thousands of officials face arrest on charges related to the Kirov assassination. Families of the accused are also targeted, establishing the principle of guilt by association that will claim hundreds of thousands of victims. Children of enemies of the people are expelled from schools, spouses lose their jobs, and entire extended families find themselves marked for destruction. International Communist parties watch nervously as Stalin's purge consumes veteran revolutionaries whose only crime was having independent political histories. The German communist refugees who fled to the Soviet Union after Hitler's rise to power discovered that survival in Stalin's Russia requires different skills than fighting fascism. Many who escaped Nazi persecution only to fall victim to Stalin's paranoia face the bitter irony of finding less tolerance for dissent in the workers' paradise than in capitalist countries. By late 1935, Stalin has successfully used Kirov's assassination to establish new precedents for political terror within the Communist Party itself. The investigation has created an atmosphere where no one feels safe, where past loyalty provides no protection, and where survival depends on absolute submission to Stalin's will. The foundations are now laid for the greatest political purge in human history. The Kirov affair marks the beginning of Stalin's assault on the very party that brought him to power. But it is only the opening move in a campaign that will ultimately consume millions of victims across every sector of Soviet society. Chapter 5. Show trials and broken spirits. The August heat of 1936 stifles the Moscow courtroom as Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, once Lenin's closest collaborators and Stalin's former allies, sit in the dock facing charges that would have been laughable if they weren't fatal. These two men, who helped create the Soviet state, now confess to fantastic crimes, plotting with Leon Trotsky to assassinate Stalin, collaborating with Nazi Germany, and organizing a vast terrorist conspiracy. Their confessions are so detailed, so comprehensive, and so obviously fabricated that they achieve Stalin's purpose perfectly, demonstrating that even the most implausible accusations can be made credible through the application of sufficient pressure. The first Moscow show trial establishes the template for political theater that will traumatize the Soviet Union for the next 3 years. Stalin personally oversees every detail, from the selection of defendants to the wording of confessions. The goal extends beyond eliminating political rivals. Stalin aims to create a public spectacle that will convince the Soviet people that their leaders must be constantly vigilant against internal enemies who wear the masks of loyal party members. Andrei Vyshinsky, the chief prosecutor, transforms the courtroom into a stage for ideological performance. His theatrical denunciations of the defendants as mad dogs and dregs of humanity serve multiple purposes in Stalin's psychological campaign. They dehumanize the accused, making their execution seem like the elimination of dangerous animals rather than the murder of political opponents. They also demonstrate the correct attitude that loyal citizens should adopt toward anyone accused of opposing the regime. The confessions themselves represent masterpieces of psychological manipulation perfected by the NKVD interrogation specialists. Months of torture, sleep deprivation, threats against family members, and promises of lenient treatment break down even the most resolute revolutionaries. But Stalin's genius lies in understanding that simple admission of guilt is insufficient. It requires elaborate testimonies that implicate others, creating an endless chain of accusations that can justify future arrests. Zinoviev and Kamenev believe they are purchasing their lives with their confessions, having been promised that cooperation will result in imprisonment rather than execution. This deception serves Stalin's purposes by ensuring that their courtroom performances appear genuine rather than forced. When they are shot immediately after the trial despite their cooperation, Stalin sends a clear message to future defendants. There is no safety in submission, only the possibility of choosing between a quick death or prolonged suffering. The international response to the trial reveals Stalin's growing confidence in his ability to manipulate both domestic and foreign opinion. Western observers, including prominent intellectuals and journalists, express surprise at the defendants' apparent sincerity in confessing to their crimes. The elaborate nature of the testimony, combined with the defendants' obvious familiarity with Marxist ideology, creates a veneer of credibility that many foreign observers accept rather than confront the disturbing reality of what they are witnessing. The psychological impact on the Soviet population proves even more devastating than Stalin anticipated. Citizens who lived through the revolution and civil war cannot understand how Lenin's closest associates could have been secret traitors all along. The trial creates a pervasive sense that no one can be trusted, that revolutionary credentials provide no protection, and that survival depends on absolute conformity to whatever Stalin defines as proper behavior. Within the Communist Party itself, the trial triggers a wave of preemptive denunciations as officials compete to demonstrate their loyalty by identifying suspicious behavior among their colleagues. Party meetings become exercises in mutual accusation as members attempt to protect themselves by destroying others. The collegiate spirit that once characterized Bolshevik leadership dissolves into an atmosphere of mutual terror where everyone becomes both hunter and potential prey. The success of the first show trial convinces Stalin that he has perfected a technique for eliminating opponents while simultaneously strengthening his control over the population. The combination of public confession, detailed testimony, and swift execution creates a spectacle that serves multiple political purposes. It eliminates enemies, intimidates potential opponents, and provides dramatic evidence of the regime's vigilance against internal threats. As news of the execution spreads through Soviet society, millions of citizens learn a lesson that will shape their behavior for decades. In Stalin's Russia, truth matters less than the appearance of loyalty, and the appearance of loyalty matters less than Stalin's perception of threat. The show trial has established the rules for survival in a state where law itself has become a weapon of terror. Chapter 6. The terror expands. The year 1937 opens with Stalin's promotion of Nikolai Yezhov to head the NKVD, replacing Genrik Yagoda, who has become another victim of the expanding purge. Yezhov, a diminutive man with piercing eyes, proves far more suited to Stalin's needs than his predecessor. Where Yagoda occasionally showed reluctance to pursue the most extreme measures, Yezhov embraces mass terror with bureaucratic enthusiasm, treating the destruction of human lives as a production problem, to be solved through better organization and increased efficiency. Under Yezhov's leadership, the NKVD transforms from a political police force into an engine of mass destruction operating on an unprecedented scale. New categories of enemies are created almost daily: former Kalaks, ethnic minorities, religious believers, intellectuals, foreigners, and eventually, NKVD operatives themselves. The terror acquires its own momentum as each wave of arrests generates new names for future persecution, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of destruction that consumes victims faster than the regime can process them. The second Moscow show trial in January 1937 targets 17 defendants, including Karl Radek, a prominent journalist and party theorist, and Gregory Pyatakov, a respected economic administrator. Their confessions follow the same pattern established in the previous year, but with even more elaborate details of sabotage and treason. Radek's performance proves particularly effective as his intellectual reputation lends credibility to accusations that might otherwise seem fantastic, demonstrating how Stalin uses each victim's strengths against them in the service of his political theater. Regional NKVD offices receive specific quotas for arrest and executions, transforming terror into a quantified administrative process. Local officials are instructed to arrest predetermined numbers of first-category enemies to be shot, and second-category enemies to be sent to labor camps, with the understanding that exceeding quotas demonstrates proper revolutionary vigilance, while falling short suggests suspicious reluctance to combat enemies of the people. The military becomes a primary target as Stalin moves to eliminate any institution capable of challenging his authority. The arrest and execution of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and 7 other top generals in June 1937 decapitates the Red Army's leadership, just as Nazi Germany prepares for war. The charges against these military leaders, conspiring with Germany and Japan to overthrow the Soviet government, are so obviously fabricated that even Stalin's closest associates privately express doubt. But the purge continues regardless of its impact on national security. The terror spreads beyond the Communist Party and government to encompass virtually every sector of Soviet society. Engineers, doctors, teachers, factory workers, farmers, and even NKVD operatives themselves face arrest on charges ranging from sabotage to espionage to terrorism. The accusations become increasingly absurd. Factory accidents become evidence of wrecking. Crop failures prove Gulag sabotage, and mechanical breakdowns demonstrate foreign-directed terrorism. Ethnic minorities face particular persecution as Stalin identifies entire nationalities as security threats. Poles, Germans, Koreans, and other ethnic groups living within Soviet borders are subjected to mass deportations or executions based solely on their ancestry. The assumption underlying these ethnic purges, that genetic heritage determines political loyalty, reveals the racist foundation beneath Stalin's ostensibly internationalist ideology. The psychological impact of mass terror creates behavioral changes that serve Stalin's purposes even better than the arrests themselves. Citizens learn to practice self-censorship so complete that even private thoughts become dangerous. Families stop discussing politics at home. Friends avoid meeting privately, and colleagues limit their conversations to safe subjects like weather or sports. The entire society develops habits of suspicion and silence that make organized opposition virtually impossible. Children become unwilling agents of surveillance as schools encourage them to report their parents' incorrect political views. The case of Pavlik Morozov, the boy who allegedly informed on his father, becomes a model for proper socialist behavior, while children who protect their families face condemnation as enemies of the people. This inversion of traditional family loyalty serves Stalin's goal of ensuring that primary allegiance flows to the state rather than to personal relationships. By the end of 1937, the Great Purge has consumed hundreds of thousands of lives and created a climate of terror that penetrates every aspect of Soviet life. But Stalin is not satisfied with the scope of destruction achieved so far. He prepares to expand the terror even further, ensuring that no corner of society remains untouched by his campaign of systematic intimidation. Chapter 7. Nitrogen monoxide, one is safe. The Third Moscow Show trial in March 1938 presents the ultimate demonstration of Stalin's ability to destroy even his most loyal servants. In the dock sit Nikolai Bukharin, once Lenin's favorite and the Communist Party's leading theorist, along with Genrik Yagoda, the former NKVD chief who orchestrated many of Stalin's previous purges. Their presence as defendants sends an unmistakable message to the Soviet population. Absolutely no one is safe from accusation, regardless of their past service to the regime or their apparent closeness to Stalin himself. Bukharin's confession proves more problematic than previous show trials because of his intellectual stature and genuine popularity among party members. Unlike other defendants who capitulated completely to NKVD pressure, Bukharin attempts to maintain some dignity while acknowledging general responsibility for opposition activities. His subtle resistance during testimony creates moments of drama that reveal the artificial nature of the proceedings. But Stalin's decision to execute him anyway demonstrates that even partial defiance will not be tolerated. The inclusion of Yagoda among the defendants serves multiple purposes in Stalin's psychological campaign. It eliminates a man who knows too many secrets about the mechanics of terror while simultaneously warning current NKVD operatives that their participation in repression provides no guarantee of future safety. The irony of Yagoda facing charges orchestrated by the same apparatus he helped create is lost on no one, reinforcing the message that loyalty to Stalin offers no permanent protection. Regional purges reach their peak intensity as local NKVD offices compete to exceed their assigned quotas for arrests and executions. In some areas, the percentage of adult males arrested approaches levels that threaten basic social functioning. But Yezhov's response is to demand even greater vigilance against enemies who might be hiding among the survivors. The terror acquires a momentum independent of any rational political objective, consuming victims simply because the machinery of repression requires constant feeding. The Gulag system strains to accommodate the massive influx of prisoners generated by the accelerated pace of arrests. New camps are hastily constructed in the Arctic regions of Siberia and the remote areas of Central Asia, often by prisoners who die during the construction process itself. The conditions in these facilities ensure that even those fortunate enough to avoid immediate execution face a prolonged death sentence through starvation, exposure, and exhausting forced labor. Families of the arrested face systematic persecution designed to eliminate any potential source of future opposition. Wives and children of enemies of the people are expelled from their homes, fired from their jobs, and often arrested themselves on charges of guilt by association. The principle of collective punishment ensures that each arrest creates multiple additional victims, multiplying the terror's impact throughout society while eliminating potential sources of sympathy for the regime's opponents. The international communist movement watches in horror as Stalin's purges consume many of the foreign communists who sought refuge in the Soviet Union. German, Polish, Hungarian, and other European communists who fled fascist persecution in their home countries discover that survival in Stalin's Russia requires different skills than fighting capitalism. Many find themselves facing execution for the crime of having international connections that Stalin now views as evidence of espionage. Professional and intellectual life in the Soviet Union becomes virtually impossible as expertise itself becomes suspect. Engineers who design successful projects face arrest for sabotage when later problems develop. Doctors who treat prominent patients are accused of poisoning them, and teachers who encourage critical thinking are condemned for spreading counter-revolutionary ideas. The cumulative effect is to create a society where competence and creativity become dangerous qualities that attract unwanted attention from the authorities. The pace of arrests accelerates beyond the capacity of the legal system to process cases, leading to mass executions without trial. Special NKVD troikas are established to handle the overflow, with three-man panels deciding life and death in minutes based on files they have barely read. The pretense of legal procedure disappears entirely as terror becomes a purely administrative process designed to achieve statistical targets rather than determine actual guilt or innocence. By late 1938, Stalin has created a society where fear operates as the primary organizing principle of social relationships. Citizens avoid forming friendships that might become politically compromising. Workers compete to denounce their colleagues before being denounced themselves, and families live in constant anxiety about which member might disappear next. The atomization of Soviet society serves Stalin's purposes by making organized resistance virtually impossible while ensuring that survival depends entirely on his personal favor. The Great Purge has achieved Stalin's fundamental objective: the creation of a population so terrorized that they will accept any level of brutality as preferable to the uncertainty of resistance. But even Stalin recognizes that terror cannot continue indefinitely at this intensity without destroying the state itself, setting the stage for a tactical retreat that will consolidate rather than abandon his system of rule through fear. Chapter 8. The End of the Purge. The arrest and execution of Nikolai Yezhov in late 1938 signals the end of the Great Purge's most intensive phase, but not because Stalin has developed humanitarian concerns. Rather, the terror has achieved its political objectives while threatening to destroy the administrative capacity necessary for governing the Soviet Union. Yezhov's replacement by Lavrenti Beria, a Georgian like Stalin himself, represents not a retreat from terror, but its institutionalization under more controlled conditions. Beria's appointment demonstrates Stalin's sophisticated understanding of how to manage fear as a tool of governance. Where Yezhov embraced mass terror with indiscriminate enthusiasm, Beria brings the systematic approach of a professional administrator who understands that effective terror must be targeted and sustainable rather than chaotic and self-destructive. The purge continues under Beria's leadership, but with greater attention to maintaining the regime's operational effectiveness. The scale of destruction achieved during the Great Purge becomes apparent as Stalin surveys the devastated landscape of Soviet society. An estimated 750,000 people have been executed, while millions more have been sent to labor camps where they face slow death through starvation, disease, and exhausting work. Entire professions have been decimated, with engineers, military officers, educators, and party officials disappearing in percentages that threaten the functioning of basic institutions. Stalin's decision to end the most intensive phase of terror reflects calculation rather than compassion. The purge has successfully eliminated all potential centers of organized opposition, while creating a population so terrorized that active resistance seems impossible. Continuing the mass arrests at the same pace risks destroying the administrative apparatus necessary for implementing his policies, particularly the ambitious industrialization programs that remain central to his vision of Soviet power. The transition from Yezhov to Beria involves a carefully orchestrated campaign to blame the excesses of the purge on the previous NKVD leadership while preserving Stalin's reputation for wise leadership. Yezhov is accused of conducting unauthorized arrests and executing loyal Soviet citizens, allowing Stalin to present himself as the defender of legality who discovered and corrected these abuses. This narrative serves multiple purposes. It provides a scapegoat for the terror's most obvious failures, while establishing Stalin's image as a leader concerned with justice. Regional NKVD offices receive new instructions to be more selective in their arrests, focusing on specific categories of suspects rather than attempting to meet numerical quotas. This change reflects not humanitarian concerns, but recognition that indiscriminate terror has reached the point of diminishing returns. The most effective terror targets those who pose genuine threats to the regime while sparing enough of the population to maintain social and economic functionality. The surviving members of Soviet society adapt to the new conditions with the psychological flexibility that characterizes all successful survivors of totalitarian systems. They learn to recognize the subtle signs that indicate when political conditions are shifting, adjusting their behavior accordingly while maintaining the habits of suspicion and self-censorship that protected them during the height of terror. The purge may be ending, but its psychological impact will shape Soviet behavior for decades. International reactions to the purge's apparent conclusion reveal the extent to which Stalin has succeeded in controlling information about his regime. Western observers who were horrified by the show trials and mass arrests now interpret the changes in NKVD leadership as evidence of Stalin's commitment to legality and justice. This misunderstanding serves Stalin's purposes by reducing international pressure for reform while maintaining his freedom to resume intensive terror whenever circumstances require it. The Communist Party emerges from the purge fundamentally transformed from a revolutionary organization into a bureaucratic instrument of Stalin's personal rule. The survivors understand that their continued existence depends entirely on avoiding any appearance of independent thought or action, making the party a more reliable tool for implementing Stalin's policies, but destroying its capacity for the kind of creative thinking that originally brought the Bolsheviks to power. Economic recovery from the purge's disruptions requires Stalin to make tactical concessions to practical necessities, including the promotion of younger administrators who lack the revolutionary credentials that made their predecessors suspect. These new officials, educated entirely under Soviet conditions, prove more reliable instruments of Stalin's rule because they have never known any other system of governance and cannot imagine alternatives to absolute obedience to the leader. The end of the Great Purge marks not the abandonment of terror as a tool of governance, but its evolution into a more sophisticated and sustainable system. Stalin has learned to calibrate fear precisely, applying just enough pressure to ensure compliance while preserving the human resources necessary for governing a modern industrial state. The machinery of terror remains in place, ready to be activated whenever Stalin perceives new threats to his power, but now operates with the efficiency of a mature bureaucracy rather than the chaos of revolutionary violence. The transition from Yezhov to Beria in late 1938 represents not a humanitarian reform, but a sophisticated evolution in Stalin's approach to managing terror as an instrument of governance. Where Yezhov had embraced mass destruction with the enthusiasm of a true believer, Beria brings the calculating mind of a professional administrator who understands that effective terror must be sustainable rather than self-destructive. His appointment signals Stalin's recognition that the purge has achieved its primary political objectives while threatening to destroy the administrative capacity necessary for governing a modern industrial state. Beria's first actions as head of the NKVD demonstrate his understanding that terror's effectiveness depends on its predictability rather than its intensity. He immediately begins reviewing cases of imprisoned officials whose technical expertise is needed for economic development. But his releases follow careful political calculations designed to demonstrate mercy while reinforcing the principle that survival depends entirely on Stalin's personal favor. This elective rehabilitation of some purge victims serves multiple purposes. It provides desperately needed expertise for industrial projects, demonstrates Stalin's wisdom in correcting previous excesses, and creates a class of grateful survivors whose loyalty is guaranteed by their understanding that their continued existence depends on continued service. The scapegoating of Yezhov for the purge's excess reveals Stalin's sophisticated understanding of how to maintain his reputation for wise leadership while acknowledging that mistakes have been made. Yezhov is accused of conducting unauthorized arrests and executing loyal Soviet citizens, allowing Stalin to present himself as the defender of legality who discovered and corrected these abuses. This narrative transformation serves multiple purposes. It provides an explanation for the purge's obvious failures without questioning its fundamental necessity, establishes Stalin's image as a leader concerned with justice rather than arbitrary power, and warns future administrators that excessive zeal can be as dangerous as insufficient loyalty. The reorganization of the NKVD under Beria's leadership demonstrates how a mature terror system operates with greater efficiency and precision than its revolutionary predecessors. New procedures are established for conducting investigations that prioritize quality over quantity, focusing on targets whose elimination serves clear political purposes rather than meeting numerical quotas. The shift from mass terror to selective repression reflects Stalin's understanding that fear works most effectively when its application appears systematic rather than random, creating an environment where citizens believe they can avoid persecution through proper behavior while remaining uncertain about exactly what constitutes safety. Regional NKVD offices receive new instructions that reflect Beria's more nuanced approach to managing terror as a tool of governance. Local officials are directed to focus their attention on specific categories of suspects: former kulaks who have returned from exile, religious believers who maintain active practices, intellectuals who show signs of independent thinking, rather than attempting to meet arbitrary arrest quotas. This targeting strategy serves multiple purposes. It maintains the pressure necessary to prevent organized opposition while preserving the human resources needed for economic development, demonstrates the regime's sophistication in identifying genuine threats, and creates incentives for citizens to modify their behavior in politically acceptable directions. The treatment of purge survivors reveals how Stalin's terror system uses the experience of persecution to create more reliable servants rather than potential opponents. Officials who have witnessed the destruction of their colleagues and narrowly escaped similar fates develop a heightened sensitivity to political signals that makes them more responsive to regime demands while less likely to engage in independent thinking. The psychological impact of surviving the purge creates a generation of administrators whose primary qualification is not competence or loyalty, but their demonstrated ability to navigate political danger while maintaining absolute submission to authority. The international implications of the purge's conclusion become apparent as Stalin begins to focus more attention on external threats that require competent rather than merely obedient personnel. The rise of Nazi Germany and the approaching war in Europe forced Stalin to balance his preference for political reliability with the practical necessity of having administrators and military officers capable of effective performance under pressure. This tension between political control and operational effectiveness becomes a permanent feature of Stalin's system, requiring constant calibration to maintain both internal security and external capabilities. Economic recovery from the purge's disruptions requires Stalin to make tactical concessions to practical necessities while maintaining the essential structure of his terror system. New administrators are promoted based partly on technical competence rather than purely political considerations, but always within frameworks that ensure their continued dependence on regime favor. The younger officials who rise to replace purged veterans prove more malleable to Stalin's requirements because they have been educated entirely under Soviet conditions and lack the independent experiences that made their predecessors potentially dangerous. The development of new administrative procedures reflects Beria's understanding that terror systems require bureaucratic sophistication to remain effective over extended periods. Standardized forms are created for processing arrests and investigations. Performance metrics are established for measuring NKVD effectiveness, and career advancement paths are defined for security personnel based on their success in implementing regime policies. The bureaucratization of terror serves multiple purposes. It creates predictable procedures that reduce the arbitrary elements that can undermine system efficiency, provides career incentives for competent personnel to serve the security apparatus, and establishes institutional mechanisms for maintaining repressive capabilities, even when specific leaders change. The role of women in Stalin's post-purge terror system reveals how gender relationships are transformed by systematic fear while appearing to maintain traditional family structures. Women whose husbands have been arrested face immediate suspicion as potential sources of counter-revolutionary sentiment, but they also gain opportunities for advancement in positions vacated by purged male officials. The regime encourages women to demonstrate their loyalty through denunciations of family members while simultaneously using their continued persecution as examples of the consequences of political unreliability. This double manipulation of women's social position serves multiple purposes. It provides additional sources of surveillance and control, demonstrates that gender provides no protection from political persecution, and creates incentives for women to compete for regime favor through demonstrations of ideological commitment. The treatment of children orphaned by the purge demonstrates how Stalin's terror system can present its most cruel policies as expressions of humanitarian concern for innocent victims. Children whose parents have been arrested are placed in state institutions where they receive ideological education designed to transform them into grateful supporters of the regime that destroyed their families. The systematic indoctrination of purge orphans serves multiple purposes. It eliminates potential sources of future opposition by converting victims into supporters, demonstrates the regime's capacity for transforming even the most hostile material into useful citizens, and provides visible evidence of Soviet concern for children's welfare despite the destruction of their families. The continued operation of the Gulag system under Beria's administration reveals how forced labor has become a permanent feature of Soviet economic development rather than a temporary expedient for handling political prisoners. New camps are established to provide workers for construction projects in remote regions where free labor would be prohibitively expensive, while existing facilities are reorganized to improve productivity without compromising their function as instruments of political control. The institutionalization of slave labor serves multiple purposes. It provides cheap workers for development projects that would otherwise be economically unfeasible, creates visible reminders of the consequences of opposing state authority, and generates revenue that helps finance the continued expansion of the security apparatus. The management of information about the purge's conclusion demonstrates Stalin's sophisticated understanding of how to control public perception of dramatic policy changes. Official media presents the transition from Yezhov to Beria as evidence of the regime's commitment to legality and justice, rather than as a retreat from previous policies, emphasizing Stalin's role in discovering and correcting abuses rather than acknowledging any fundamental problems with the terror system itself. This narrative management serves multiple purposes. It maintains Stalin's reputation for wise leadership while explaining obvious policy changes, provides reassurance to nervous citizens without questioning the regime's right to conduct future repression, and establishes precedents for presenting tactical adjustments as principled reforms. The adaptation of terror techniques to changing international conditions reveals how Stalin's domestic control methods can be modified to serve foreign policy objectives without losing their essential characteristics. As tensions with Nazi Germany increase, Soviet intelligence services begin applying purge techniques to identify and eliminate potential fifth columnists while simultaneously using similar methods to penetrate and manipulate foreign communist parties. The internationalization of terror serves multiple purposes. It extends Soviet influence beyond national borders, provides testing grounds for refining control techniques, and demonstrates the universal applicability of methods developed for domestic repression. The psychological impact of the purge (SN) on Soviet society reveals how populations adapt to changing levels of terror while maintaining the behavioral patterns necessary for survival under authoritarian rule. Citizens who have learned to navigate the extreme dangers of mass purges find that the skills developed for surviving arbitrary persecution serve them equally well under more predictable forms of repression. The continuation of fear-based behavior, even after the immediate threat has diminished, demonstrates how terror systems create lasting changes in social psychology that persist long after the specific policies that created them have been modified or abandoned. The development of new cadres to replace purged officials demonstrates how Stalin's terror system can regenerate its own personnel while maintaining essential continuity in policy and approach. Younger administrators who rise to fill vacated positions bring technical competence and ideological reliability that their predecessors often lacked. Having been educated entirely under Soviet conditions and lacking exposure to alternative political systems, the recruitment of new leadership serves multiple purposes. It provides competent personnel for managing complex administrative tasks, ensures that future officials will be products of the Soviet system rather than converts to it, and demonstrates the regime's capacity for self-renewal, even after massive disruptions to its personnel structure. The establishment of new procedures for managing potential threats reveals how mature terror systems operate through prevention rather than reaction, identifying and neutralizing opposition before it can develop into organized resistance. Citizens learn that survival depends not just on avoiding actively hostile behavior, but on demonstrating positive enthusiasm for regime objectives through participation in approved activities and denunciation of suspicious behaviors among colleagues and neighbors. This shift from reactive to preventive terror serves multiple purposes. It reduces the need for dramatic interventions that can disrupt normal social functioning, creates opportunities for citizens to demonstrate loyalty through cooperation with security services, and ensures that potential opposition is identified and eliminated before it can achieve sufficient organization to pose genuine threats to regime stability. Chapter 9. Terror as Governance. By 1939, Stalin had perfected a system of governance where fear operates not as an occasional tool of control, but as the fundamental organizing principle of the Soviet state. The Great Purge may have ended, but its psychological impact creates lasting changes in behavior that serve Stalin's purposes more effectively than continuous mass arrests. Citizens have internalized the lessons of terror so completely that they regulate their own behavior according to principles of absolute caution and submission. The institutionalization of fear under various NKVD leadership demonstrates Stalin's stranding that effective terror must become routine rather than spectacular. Regular arrests continue at a reduced but steady pace, ensuring that the threat of persecution remains real while avoiding the economic disruption caused by indiscriminate mass repression. This calibrated approach maintains the atmosphere of anxiety that Stalin requires while preserving the human resources necessary for industrial production and military defense. The war against Finland in late 1939 reveals both the military consequences of the purge and Stalin's ability to adapt his terror system to wartime conditions. The Red Army has poor performance against the much smaller Finnish forces exposes the devastating impact of purging experienced military leaders. But Stalin responds not by abandoning terror, but by applying it more selectively. Officers who fail in combat face execution for treason, while those who succeed receive rewards that demonstrate the benefits of serving Stalin's regime effectively. The Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939 provides Stalin with opportunities to extend his terror system into newly acquired territories in Poland and the Baltic states. The systematic persecution of local elites, intellectuals, and potential sources of resistance in these regions follows the same patterns established within the Soviet Union, demonstrating that Stalin's methods can be exported and adapted to different cultural contexts. The Katyn massacre, where thousands of Polish officers are executed by the NKVD, represents the application of Soviet terror techniques to eliminate entire categories of potential opposition leaders. Daily life in Stalin's Soviet Union becomes a constant exercise in political calculation as citizens learn to navigate the complex rules of survival under a terror regime. Conversations are conducted with the awareness that any statement might be reported to authorities and interpreted as evidence of disloyalty. Workers compete to demonstrate their enthusiasm for Stalin's policies, while avoiding the kind of prominence that might attract unwanted attention from security services. The optimal strategy becomes one of visible mediocrity, performing adequately enough to avoid accusations of sabotage while remaining inconspicuous enough to escape notice as a potential threat. The educational system transforms into a mechanism for producing citizens whose thinking patterns conform to Stalin's requirements for social control. Students learn not just specific subjects, but habits of intellectual submission that make independent thought seem dangerous and unnatural. Teachers who encourage critical analysis face accusations of spreading counter-revolutionary ideas, while those who focus on rote memorization and ideological conformity receive recognition as model educators. Religious persecution intensifies as Stalin recognizes organized religion as a potential alternative source of authority that might compete with absolute loyalty to the state. Churches are closed, priests are arrested, and religious practices are driven underground through systematic harassment. The assault on religion serves multiple purposes. It eliminates institutions that might organize resistance, demonstrates the futility of relying on any authority other than Stalin, and forces believers to choose between their faith and their safety. Cultural production becomes another arena for demonstrating the effectiveness of terror as a tool of social control. Writers, artists, musicians, and filmmakers learn to create works that celebrate Stalin's regime while avoiding any content that might be interpreted as criticism or independent thought. The development of socialist realism as the mandatory artistic style ensures that cultural expression reinforces rather than challenges the political messages that Stalin wants to communicate to Soviet citizens. The Gulag system evolves into a permanent feature of Soviet society rather than a temporary expedient for handling political prisoners. Millions of inmates provide slave labor for construction projects, mining operations, and manufacturing facilities that contribute significantly to Soviet economic development. The camps serve multiple functions simultaneously. They eliminate political opponents, provide cheap labor for industrialization, and create a visible reminder of the consequences of opposing Stalin's will. Family life adapts to the requirements of survival under terror through the development of elaborate strategies for protecting loved ones from political persecution. Parents teach children which topics are safe for discussion at home versus at school. Spouses avoid sharing political opinions that might compromise each other, and extended families develop codes for communicating dangerous information without creating evidence that could be used against them by authorities. The medical profession faces particular challenges as doctors struggle to treat patience while avoiding political accusations. Treating prominent figures carries the risk of being blamed if they die, while refusing treatment might be interpreted as sabotage. Medical professionals learn to document their procedures extensively and avoid making diagnoses that might have political implications, prioritizing their own safety over optimal patient care when the two considerations conflict. Economic planning becomes an exercise in political survival as administrators attempt to meet impossible production targets while avoiding the blame for inevitable failures. Managers learn to manipulate statistics, hide problems, and shift responsibility to subordinates when difficulties arise. The culture of fear infiltrates every level of the economic system, creating inefficiencies that persist for decades because addressing them honestly would require admitting failures that might be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty. International communist parties worldwide observe Stalin's terror system with a mixture of admiration and anxiety, recognizing its effectiveness in eliminating opposition while fearing that similar methods might be applied to their own organizations. Many foreign communists convince themselves that the harsh measures are necessary for protecting socialism from its enemies, demonstrating how ideology can be used to rationalize even the most extreme forms of political persecution. By 1940, Stalin has created a society where terror operates so efficiently that it requires minimal maintenance to remain effective. The habits of fear and submission have become so deeply ingrained in Soviet behavior that citizens police themselves more effectively than any external surveillance system could achieve. The transformation is complete. An entire civilization has learned to live according to the logic of terror, making organized resistance virtually impossible while ensuring that Stalin's power remains absolute and unchallenged. The consolidation of Stalin's terror system by 1939 creates a society where fear operates not as an emergency measure, but as the fundamental organizing principle of daily existence. Citizens develop elaborate psychological mechanisms for navigating a world where survival depends on constant calculation of political risk, leading to behavioral adaptations that become so deeply ingrained they persist long after the immediate threat has passed. The successful internalization of terror represents Stalin's greatest achievement, the creation of a population that polices itself more effectively than any external surveillance system could possibly manage. The bureaucratization of fear under Beria's leadership transforms the NKVD from an instrument of revolutionary violence into a sophisticated administrative apparatus capable of processing human destruction with industrial efficiency. New standardized procedures are developed for conducting arrests, interrogations, and executions, complete with forms, quotas, and performance metrics that treat the elimination of human lives as a routine bureaucratic function. The systematization of terror serves multiple purposes. It ensures consistent application of repressive policies across the vast Soviet territory, provides career advancement opportunities for ambitious administrators, and creates the illusion that persecution follows rational rather than arbitrary principles. The integration of terror apparatus with normal governmental functions creates a dual administrative system where every official institution operates according to both its ostensible purpose and its surveillance responsibilities. School principals serve as educators and informants. Factory managers oversee production and political reliability, and hospital administrators manage medical care while monitoring patients for signs of disloyalty. This fusion of terror with routine governance ensures that political control penetrates every aspect of social organization while making resistance organizationally impossible by eliminating any space free from state observation. The development of socialist realist culture demonstrates how Stalin's terror system can shape not just political behavior, but aesthetic sensibility and creative expression. Artists, writers, musicians, and filmmakers learn to produce works that celebrate Soviet achievements while avoiding any content that might be interpreted as criticism or independent thought. The creation of officially approved cultural products requires artists to internalize the regime's ideological requirements so completely that self-censorship becomes automatic, eliminating the need for extensive external oversight while ensuring that all cultural expression reinforces official messages. The transformation of the legal system into an instrument of political control reveals how traditional concepts of justice can be systematically perverted to serve terror objectives. Soviet courts operate according to the principle that the state's political needs supersede individual rights or procedural fairness, with judges understanding that their primary responsibility involves supporting regime objectives rather than determining factual guilt or innocence. Legal proceedings become theatrical performances designed to reinforce official narratives about crime and punishment while providing the appearance of due process for actions that are fundamentally arbitrary. The educational system has evolution into an apparatus for producing ideologically reliable citizens demonstrates how terror techniques can be applied to children through methods that appear benevolent while serving systematic indoctrination purposes. Students learn not just academic subjects, but habits of thought that make questioning official authority seem dangerous and unnatural. Teachers who encourage independent thinking face accusations of promoting counter-revolutionary ideas, while those who focus on ideological conformity receive recognition and advancement. The systematic suppression of intellectual curiosity serves Stalin's need for a compliant population while ensuring that future generations will be less capable of recognizing or resisting authoritarian manipulation. The treatment of ethnic minorities during this period reveals how Stalin's terror system can adapt traditional prejudices to serve new political objectives while maintaining the facade of socialist internationalism. Ethnic groups that maintain strong cultural identities or cross-border connections face systematic persecution based on accusations that their loyalty to Soviet authority is compromised by alternative allegiances. The deportation and persecution of ethnic minorities serves multiple purposes. It eliminates potential sources of separatist sentiment, provides scapegoats for economic failures, and demonstrates that even officially protected groups can become enemies when political circumstances change. The management of economic production under terror conditions creates a paradoxical system where fear simultaneously motivates extraordinary effort and systematic inefficiency. Workers and managers driven by terror achieve remarkable short-term results in meeting production quotas, but the same fear prevents them from addressing underlying problems that might compromise long-term productivity. The economy develops chronic patterns of waste, concealment, and misdirection as participants prioritize avoiding blame over optimizing results, creating inefficiencies that persist for decades because correcting them requires admitting failures that might be interpreted as sabotage. The development of the Gulag as a permanent feature of Soviet society transforms forced labor from a method of punishment into a cornerstone of economic development. New camps are established not just to handle political prisoners, but to provide labor for construction projects, mining operations, and industrial facilities that would be economically unfeasible under normal wage conditions. The camps serve multiple functions simultaneously. They eliminate political opposition, provide cheap labor for development projects, and create visible reminders of the consequences of opposing state authority. Daily life in Stalin's Gulag reveals the ultimate expression of terror as a system of social organization, creating communities where survival depends entirely on understanding and adapting to rules that prioritize political conformity over human welfare. Prisoners develop elaborate strategies for navigating camp hierarchies, managing relationships with guards and administrators, and maintaining psychological equilibrium under conditions designed to destroy individual identity and resistance capacity. The camps become laboratories for testing the limits of human adaptation to systematic dehumanization while providing models for social control that influence broader Soviet society. The treatment of families affected by political persecution demonstrates how Stalin's terror system uses collective punishment to multiply its impact throughout society while eliminating potential sources of sympathy for regime opponents. Wives and children of arrested individuals face automatic persecution through loss of housing, employment, and educational opportunities, ensuring that each arrest creates multiple additional victims who serve as visible warnings to other citizens. The principle of guilt by association extends terror's reach far beyond its immediate targets while creating incentives for preemptive denunciation as families attempt to protect themselves by demonstrating greater loyalty than their persecuted relatives. Religious communities face increasingly sophisticated persecution as Stalin's regime develops techniques for eliminating religious authority while avoiding the appearance of direct assault on believers' rights. Churches are closed for violations of building codes rather than explicit religious persecution. Clergy are arrested for tax evasion rather than theological activities, and religious education is prohibited as contrary to scientific socialism rather than freedom of worship. The indirect approach to religious persecution serves multiple purposes. It eliminates alternative sources of moral authority, demonstrates the regime's sophistication and legal manipulation, and avoids creating obvious martyrs who might inspire resistance. The psychological impact of sustained terror creates behavioral changes that serve Stalin's political objectives even when direct surveillance is impossible. Citizens develop habits of self-censorship so complete that they avoid not just dangerous actions but dangerous thoughts, creating a form of internal control that operates more effectively than external monitoring. The internalization of fear extends to private relationships as individuals learn to evaluate friends, family members, and colleagues as potential sources of denunciation, fragmenting social bonds that might otherwise provide foundations for collective resistance. The management of information under Stalin's terror system demonstrates how truth itself can be weaponized to serve political control through the systematic manipulation of citizens' understanding of reality. Official media provides carefully constructed accounts of domestic and international events that support regime narratives while concealing information that might encourage independent thinking or comparison with alternative systems. The creation of a controlled information environment serves multiple purposes. It prevents citizens from developing accurate assessments of their conditions, eliminates sources of alternative political ideas, and ensures that regime failures can be attributed to external enemies or internal saboteurs rather than policy mistakes. The development of Soviet science under terror conditions reveals how fear can both motivate extraordinary achievement and systematically undermine the intellectual honesty necessary for genuine scientific progress. Scientists who produce results that support official ideology receive generous support and recognition, while those whose research suggests inconvenient conclusions face accusations of promoting bourgeois pseudoscience. The subordination of scientific method to political requirements creates a system where some fields advance rapidly while others stagnate, demonstrating how terror can selectively enhance or suppress intellectual development based on its utility to regime objectives. The training of NKVD operatives reveals how Stalin's regime creates professional cadres capable of implementing systematic terror while maintaining psychological equilibrium and bureaucratic efficiency. Security personnel learn techniques for conducting interrogations, managing informant networks, and processing arrests that treat human destruction as a technical problem requiring specialized skills rather than a moral issue involving individual conscience. The professionalization of terror creates career paths for individuals whose advancement depends on their effectiveness in implementing repressive policies, ensuring a steady supply of competent personnel for maintaining the system's operations. The relationship between Stalin's terror system and international Communist movements demonstrates how domestic control techniques can be exported to serve broader political objectives while maintaining central coordination from Moscow. Foreign communist parties operating under Soviet guidance adapt Stalinist methods to their local conditions while reporting regularly on their implementation of approved techniques. The international expansion of terror methods serves multiple purposes. It creates reliable allies for Soviet foreign policy, provides testing grounds for refining control techniques, and demonstrates the universal applicability of Stalin's innovations in social organization. The treatment of diplomats and international travelers reveals how Stalin's terror system manages the challenge of maintaining domestic control while engaging in necessary international relations. Soviet citizens who travel abroad face intensive debriefing upon their return, with security services examining every aspect of their foreign experiences for signs of contamination by alternative political ideas. The isolation of international travelers from normal Soviet society after their return serves the dual purpose of preventing the spread of dangerous information while ensuring that exposure to foreign conditions does not create sources of internal criticism. The integration of terror techniques with urban planning and architecture demonstrates how physical environments can be designed to reinforce political control while appearing to serve purely practical functions. New Soviet cities are constructed with layouts that facilitate surveillance and crowd control, while public buildings are designed to reinforce messages about state power and individual insignificance. The use of architecture as a tool of political control serves multiple purposes. It creates environments that psychologically reinforce official ideology, demonstrates the regime's capacity for comprehensive social planning, and provides visible symbols of state authority that operate continuously without requiring active maintenance. The management of consumer goods distribution under terror conditions reveals how scarcity itself can be weaponized to serve political control by making survival dependent on political reliability. Access to basic necessities like food, housing, and clothing depends not just on economic factors, but on political status, with citizens understanding that maintaining regime favor is necessary for meeting fundamental needs. The politicization of economic distribution serves multiple purposes. It ensures that survival depends on political compliance, provides rewards and punishments that reinforce desired behaviors, and creates visible hierarchies that demonstrate the benefits of serving state objectives. The development of Soviet medicine under terror conditions shows how even the most humanitarian professions can be transformed into instruments of political control while maintaining their ostensible purpose of promoting human welfare. Medical professionals learn to balance clinical considerations with political requirements, understanding that treating prominent patients carries risks if they die from natural causes that might be reinterpreted as evidence of sabotage. The subordination of medical practice to political considerations serves multiple purposes. It ensures that healthcare professionals serve regime objectives, creates additional surveillance opportunities through medical records and patient contacts, and demonstrates that no aspect of human experience remains free from political calculation. The transformation of childhood and family life under Stalin's terror system reveals how systematic fear can reshape the most fundamental human relationships, while appearing to strengthen rather than weaken social bonds. Children learn to love Stalin more than their parents, understanding that family loyalty must yield to political devotion when the two conflict. Parents develop strategies for protecting their children that involve teaching them to conceal family conversations and opinions that might be interpreted as politically dangerous. The corruption of family relationships serves multiple purposes. It prevents the development of alternative loyalty structures, creates additional sources of surveillance and control, and ensures that regime authority penetrates the most intimate aspects of human experience. Chapter 10. The Ultimate Test of Terror. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, presents the ultimate test of whether a society organized around fear can survive existential military threat. Stalin's initial paralysis, reportedly spending several days in his dacha, refusing to believe that Hitler has betrayed their non-aggression pact, reveals the psychological limitations of a leader whose power depends entirely on controlling information and eliminating anyone who might challenge his judgment. The early military disasters that followed the German attack exposed the devastating consequences of Stalin's terror system for national defense. The purged military leadership cannot be quickly replaced, as the survivors are too terrified to take initiative without explicit orders from above. Officers who might organize effective resistance hesitate to act because unauthorized retreats or tactical decisions could be interpreted as treason, leading to execution regardless of their military necessity. The rapid German advance toward Moscow and Leningrad forces Stalin to make tactical adjustments to his terror system without abandoning its fundamental principles. Some imprisoned officers are released from the Gulag to help organize defense, but only after their families are threatened to ensure continued loyalty. The message remains clear. Cooperation with the regime might bring temporary reprieve, but independent action still carries fatal consequences. The siege of Leningrad becomes a laboratory for observing how Stalin's terror system functions under extreme conditions. As hundreds of thousands of civilians starved during the 872-day blockade, party officials continue to prioritize ideological conformity over survival strategies that might suggest criticism of government policies. Residents who suggest unauthorized food distribution or evacuation plans face arrest for defeatism, even as the city's population dies from hunger and disease. Stalin's response to military setbacks reveals his understanding that terror can be adapted to wartime conditions without losing its effectiveness as a tool of control. The Order 227 directive, not one step back, makes retreat without authorization, punishable by death while establishing blocking detachments that shoot their own soldiers who attempt to flee. This militarization of terror demonstrates how fear can be weaponized even against external enemies rather than just internal opposition. The treatment of Soviet prisoners captured by German forces illustrates the extent to which Stalin's terror system prioritizes regime survival over human life. Soldiers who surrender rather than fight to the death are labeled traitors, ensuring that their families face persecution regardless of the circumstances surrounding their capture. This policy serves multiple purposes. It motivates desperate resistance by eliminating the option of honorable surrender, while demonstrating that loyalty to Stalin matters more than survival itself. Civilian populations in occupied territories face a terrible choice between German occupation and Soviet liberation, as both options carry enormous risks. Stalin's partisans behind enemy lines are instructed to eliminate not just German collaborators, but also civilians who have simply survived under occupation, based on the assumption that survival itself suggests insufficient resistance to enemy rule. The terror system thus continues operating, even in areas temporarily beyond direct Soviet control. The gradual military recovery that begins with the defense of Moscow in late 1941 validates Stalin's calculation that terror can coexist with effective resistance when properly calibrated. Officers who demonstrate competence in combat receive promotions and rewards, while those who fail face execution, creating incentives for professional excellence within a framework of absolute political obedience. The system produces military leaders like Georgy Zhukov, who achieve tactical brilliance while maintaining complete submission to Stalin's authority. War production demonstrates both the strengths and weaknesses of an economy organized around fear. The massive evacuation of factories to the Urals and beyond succeeds because managers are more afraid of Stalin than of German bombers. But chronic inefficiencies persist because workers and administrators prioritize avoiding blame over optimizing production. The Soviet Union ultimately outproduces Germany not because of superior economic organization, but because terror motivates sufficient effort to compensate for systematic inefficiencies. The treatment of ethnic minorities during wartime reveals how Stalin's terror system can escalate to genocidal levels when combined with military pressures. Entire populations, Chechens, Ingush, Tatars, and others, are deported to Central Asia based on collective accusations of collaboration with German forces. These mass deportations demonstrate that Stalin's concept of political loyalty extends to genetic categories, making ethnicity itself a form of political vulnerability. International alliances create new challenges for Stalin's terror system as cooperation with Britain and the United States requires some moderation of the most obvious forms of repression. Western allies who visit the Soviet Union must be prevented from observing the full extent of the Gulag system, leading to elaborate efforts to conceal evidence of mass persecution. But these tactical adjustments do not represent fundamental changes in Stalin's approach. They merely demonstrate his ability to manage international perceptions while maintaining domestic terror. The eventual Soviet victory over Germany validates Stalin's claim that his terror system represents the most effective form of social organization for defending socialist achievements. The millions of dead and the enormous suffering endured during the war are presented as proof of the population's devotion to Stalin rather than evidence of his system as failures. This narrative transformation demonstrates the ultimate sophistication of Stalin's approach. Even the consequences of his own policies can be reinterpreted as evidence of their necessity and effectiveness. By 1945, Stalin has proven that a society organized around fear can not only survive external military threat, but can emerge victorious against enemies who underestimated the motivational power of terror when properly applied. The war becomes validation rather than contradiction of his methods, setting the stage for their expansion into newly conquered territories across Eastern Europe. The German invasion shatters Stalin's carefully constructed world of controlled information and predictable enemies, forcing him to confront the reality that external threats can overwhelm even the most sophisticated domestic terror apparatus. For the first time since consolidating power, Stalin faces opponents who cannot be intimidated, tortured into confession, or eliminated through show trials. The Wehrmacht's rapid advance exposes the fundamental weakness of a military system organized around fear rather than competence, as officers paralyzed by terror prove incapable of the flexible thinking necessary for effective resistance. The initial chaos following the German attack reveals how thoroughly Stalin's terror system has undermined the Soviet Union's capacity for rapid decision-making in crisis situations. Military commanders who might organize effective defensive actions hesitate to act without explicit authorization from Moscow, knowing that unauthorized initiatives could be interpreted as treasonous regardless of their military necessity. The result is a cascade of missed opportunities and tactical disasters as German forces encounter resistance that is fierce but poorly coordinated, brave but systematically undermined by the very system it seeks to defend. Stalin's personal response to the invasion demonstrates how even the architect of a terror system can become its victim when reality refuses to conform to his constructed version of truth. His initial retreat to his dacha and refusal to believe intelligence reports about German preparations reflect not just personal shock, but the inevitable consequence of creating an information environment where uncomfortable truths are systematically suppressed. The subordinates who might have provided accurate warnings have learned through bitter experience that Stalin punishes messengers who bring unwelcome news, creating the very intelligence failures that leave him vulnerable to surprise attack. The evacuation of Soviet industry from threatened Western regions to the Urals and beyond becomes both a testament to the mobilization capacity of Stalin's system and a revelation of its human costs. Entire factories are dismantled and relocated within weeks. along with their workforces. But the process involves massive suffering as families are separated and workers are assigned to new locations, based purely on industrial necessity rather than human considerations. The successful preservation of Soviet productive capacity comes at the price of treating human beings as interchangeable components in an industrial machine, demonstrating how terror-based systems can achieve remarkable logistical feats while completely disregarding individual welfare. The battle for Moscow in late 1941 provides the first clear test of whether Stalin's terror system can generate effective resistance against a competent external enemy. The successful defense of the capital demonstrates that fear can motivate extraordinary sacrifice when properly channeled, as soldiers and civilians alike understand that retreat offers no safety when the alternative to victory is not just personal death, but the complete destruction of their social system. The mobilization of the Moscow population for defensive construction projects reveals how terror techniques can be adapted to wartime conditions, with civilian workers driven to superhuman efforts by the knowledge that failure to contribute adequately to the city's defense might be interpreted as sabotage. The implementation of Order 227, not one step back, represents Stalin's systematic application of terror principles to military organization under wartime conditions. The creation of blocking detachments with orders to shoot retreating soldiers transforms the Red Army into a force trapped between German enemies in front and Soviet executioners behind, eliminating the option of unauthorized retreat while ensuring that resistance continues even when tactical withdrawal might be militarily sensible. This militarization of terror demonstrates how fear-based motivation can be adapted to combat conditions, creating armies that fight with desperate courage born of the knowledge that survival depends entirely on victory. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war reveals how Stalin's terror logic prioritizes regime survival over human life, even when applied to the regime's own defenders. The policy of treating captured soldiers as traitors, regardless of the circumstances of their capture, serves multiple purposes. It motivates desperate resistance by eliminating the possibility of honorable surrender, prevents the spread of information about conditions in German-occupied territory, and eliminates potential sources of criticism regarding the regime's military preparedness. The families of captured soldiers face immediate persecution, ensuring that even successful military service provides no guarantee of protection for loved ones. The siege of Leningrad becomes a laboratory for observing how Stalin's terror system functions under the ultimate test of survival. As the city's population slowly starves during the 872-day blockade, party officials continue to enforce ideological conformity, even when such enforcement seems to serve no practical purpose. Citizens who suggest unauthorized food distribution methods or question official optimism about relief efforts face arrest for defeatism, creating the paradox of a besieged city where survival depends as much on political conformity as on access to food. The maintenance of terror apparatus functions even under conditions of mass starvation demonstrates the system's priority of political control over simple human survival. The partisan warfare behind German lines provides Stalin with opportunities to extend his terror system into occupied territories through the systematic elimination of civilians suspected of collaboration. Soviet partisans operating in German-occupied areas receive instructions that go beyond military objectives to include the punishment of local populations who have adapted to enemy occupation. The execution of villagers who have traded with German forces or accepted German administrative positions serves the dual purpose of punishing collaboration while demonstrating that Soviet authority continues to operate even in areas temporarily beyond direct control. The development of Soviet war production under siege conditions reveals both the strengths and fundamental contradictions of an economy organized around fear. Factory managers who might normally focus on concealing production problems instead channel their terror into achieving impossible production targets, understanding that military defeat represents a threat greater than any punishment Stalin might impose for admitting difficulties. The result is a surge in armaments production that ultimately proves decisive in the war, but achieved at enormous human cost as workers are driven beyond the limits of physical endurance by managers who are themselves driven by mortal fear of failure. The treatment of ethnic minorities during wartime demonstrates how Stalin's terror system can escalate to genocidal levels when combined with military pressures and convenient scapegoats. The mass deportation of Chechens, Ingush, Kalmyks, and other ethnic groups accused of collective collaboration with German forces represents the application of terror techniques to entire populations based solely on ethnic identity. These deportations continue even when the military situation has stabilized, suggesting that they serve political purposes related to Stalin's long-term vision of Soviet society rather than immediate military necessity. The role of women in Stalin's wartime terror system reveals how systematic oppression adapts to changing social conditions while maintaining its essential characteristics. As men are mobilized for military service, women assume greater responsibilities in maintaining domestic surveillance and ideological enforcement, but always under the supervision of security apparatus that remains fundamentally male-dominated. Female factory workers who exceed production quotas are celebrated as heroic examples of socialist dedication, while those who express doubt about official optimism face the same accusations of defeatism that threaten their male counterparts. The management of information during wartime requires Stalin to balance the need for maintaining morale with his systematic preference for controlling all sources of independent knowledge. Soviet citizens are provided with carefully filtered accounts of military progress that emphasize heroic resistance while concealing the full extent of early disasters. But the proximity of combat zones makes complete information control impossible. The regime adapts by acknowledging some negative developments while interpreting them within frameworks that reinforce rather than undermine confidence in ultimate victory under Stalin's leadership. The relationship between Stalin's regime and its Western allies creates complex challenges for a system based on the assumption that all external contact represents potential contamination by hostile influences. The necessity of military cooperation with Britain and the United States requires some moderation of the most obvious forms of repression when allied observers are present, but these tactical adjustments never extend to fundamental changes in domestic terror practices. Soviet officials who interact with Western allies face particularly intense scrutiny after such contacts, as their exposure to alternative political systems makes them potential sources of dangerous comparisons. The production of wartime propaganda reveals how Stalin's terror system can adapt its messaging to changing circumstances while maintaining core themes of obedience and sacrifice. Cultural products celebrating military heroism serve the dual purpose of maintaining morale and reinforcing the message that individual value derives entirely from service to the collective cause as defined by Stalin. Writers, filmmakers, and artists who create effective propaganda receive temporary protection from persecution, but always with the understanding that their safety depends on continued production of ideologically acceptable material. The reconstruction of liberated territories provides Stalin with opportunities to implement more sophisticated versions of his terror techniques informed by wartime experience. Areas recovered from German occupation are treated as contaminated by enemy influence, requiring systematic purification through the identification and elimination of actual or potential collaborators. The rebuilding process becomes an exercise in social engineering as well as physical reconstruction, with new communities organized according to principles that prioritize surveillance and control over traditional social relationships or economic efficiency. The development of military leadership under wartime conditions demonstrates how Stalin's terror system can produce effective commanders when survival pressures override normal patterns of political intimidation. Officers like Georgy Zhukov Konstantin Rokossovsky, and Alexei Antonov achieved tactical brilliance while maintaining absolute political submission, creating a model for managing expertise within frameworks of systematic intimidation. Their success provides Stalin with evidence that terror-based systems can generate competent leadership when properly calibrated, reinforcing his confidence in the fundamental soundness of his methods. The handling of civilian evacuees from combat zones reveals how Stalin's regime treats its own population as potentially hostile material that requires constant surveillance and control. Families fleeing advancing German forces face immediate scrutiny regarding their reasons for evacuation, their behavior during enemy occupation, and their loyalty to Soviet authority. The evacuation process becomes another opportunity for social sorting as politically reliable individuals receive priority for transportation and housing, while those deemed suspicious face abandonment in combat zones or assignment to forced labor details. The organization of rear area security demonstrates how Stalin's terror apparatus adapts to wartime conditions by expanding its functions to include military as well as political objectives. NKVD troops assigned to rear area duties serve multiple functions. They maintain order among civilian populations, prevent unauthorized movement between regions, and ensure that military units maintain proper political orientation. The integration of security functions with military operations creates a unified system of control that operates according to terror principles, even when serving apparently practical military purposes. The treatment of foreign communists and other international supporters who find themselves in the Soviet Union during wartime reveals the paranoid logic underlying Stalin's approach to all external relationships. Communist refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, who might reasonably expect protection from a fellow socialist state, instead face suspicion and persecution based on their foreign origins and potential exposure to non-Soviet influences. Their persecution serves no rational security purpose but demonstrates Stalin's conviction that any independent source of communist authority represents a potential threat to his absolute control over the international movement. The development of Soviet intelligence operations during wartime shows how Stalin's domestic terror techniques can be exported to serve international objectives while maintaining their essential characteristics of systematic intimidation and control. Soviet agents operating in occupied Europe apply methods developed for domestic repression to the task of organizing resistance movements, creating networks that serve military objectives while establishing precedents for post-war Soviet influence. The success of these operations provides Stalin with evidence that his methods can be effectively adapted to international contexts, setting the stage for their post-war expansion into Eastern Europe. The ultimate test of Stalin's terror system during World War II demonstrates both its capacity for generating extraordinary human sacrifice and its fundamental inability to create the kind of flexible, innovative thinking necessary for optimal military performance. The Soviet Union's eventual victory comes not because terror produces superior military organization, but because the system's capacity for mobilizing human resources through fear compensates for its systematic suppression of military creativity and initiative. The war thus validates Stalin's methods not by proving their superiority, but by demonstrating their viability under the most extreme possible conditions, setting the stage for their post-war expansion and refinement. Chapter 11. Terror Triumphant. The Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in 1945 provides Stalin with the ultimate vindication of his terror system, allowing him to present the enormous sacrifices of war as evidence that fear-based governance produces superior results to democratic alternatives. The returning Red Army carries Stalin's methods into Eastern Europe, establishing satellite states where Soviet terror techniques are adapted to local conditions while maintaining their essential characteristics of systematic intimidation and absolute obedience to Moscow's authority. The post-war years witnessed the refinement rather than the abandonment of Stalin's terror system as he adapts its methods to address new challenges facing the Soviet Union. The atomic bomb, as development by the United States, creates fresh anxieties about national security that justify expanded surveillance and persecution of anyone with potential connections to foreign powers. Scientists, intellectuals, and government officials who've had contact with Western allies during the war find themselves suspect, regardless of their contributions to Soviet victory. The campaign against cosmopolitanism demonstrates Stalin's ability to use anti-Semitism as a tool of political control while maintaining the facade of socialist internationalism. Jewish intellectuals, doctors, and cultural figures face systematic persecution based on accusations that their ethnic identity makes them inherently disloyal to Soviet interests. The Doctor's Plot of 1950 to 1953, in which prominent physicians are accused of murdering party leaders, represents the culmination of this strategy, showing how Stalin can weaponize ethnic prejudice to eliminate potential opposition. Stalin's approach to governing the newly acquired territories in Eastern Europe reveals the exportability of his terror methods to different cultural contexts. Local communist parties in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other Soviet satellites adopt modified versions of Stalin's techniques, conducting their own purges, show trials, and deportations under direct supervision from Moscow. The success of these transplanted terror systems demonstrates that fear-based governance can transcend national and cultural boundaries when properly implemented. The nuclear arms race creates new opportunities for Stalin to apply terror techniques to scientific and technical personnel who might have access to state secrets. The development of Soviet atomic weapons requires massive security operations that subject thousands of researchers, engineers, and support staff to constant surveillance and periodic interrogation. The scientific community learns to balance the demands of technical innovation with the requirements of political conformity, creating a model for managing expertise under conditions of systematic suspicion. Consumer goods shortages and economic inefficiencies persist throughout Stalin's final years, but these problems are addressed through terror rather than reform. Workers who complain about living conditions face arrest for spreading defeatist propaganda, while managers who fail to meet production targets are accused of sabotage. The terror system's response to economic problems creates a feedback loop where addressing difficulties honestly becomes more dangerous than concealing them, perpetuating the inefficiencies that originally created the problems. Cultural control reaches new levels of sophistication as Stalin's regime develops techniques for managing artistic and intellectual production that go beyond simple censorship to shape the creative process itself. Writers, composers, filmmakers, and other cultural workers internalize the requirements of political acceptability so completely that self-censorship becomes automatic, eliminating the need for extensive external oversight while ensuring that cultural products reinforce rather than challenge official ideology. The aging Stalin's increasing paranoia in his final years demonstrates how terror systems can become self-perpetuating even when they no longer serve rational political objectives. The leader who created the apparatus of fear becomes its prisoner, unable to trust even his closest associates and constantly searching for new enemies to justify the continued existence of the system that maintains his power. The projected purge of government and party leadership that Stalin appears to be planning at the time of his death suggests that terror had become an end in itself rather than a means to achieve specific political goals. International communist movements worldwide study Stalin's methods with a mixture of admiration and apprehension, recognizing their effectiveness while understanding their implications for human freedom and dignity. The successful export of Soviet-style terror to China, North Korea, and other communist states demonstrates the global applicability of Stalin's innovations in social control, creating a template for authoritarian governance that influences political development across multiple continents. The death of Stalin on March 5, 1953, marks the end of an era, but not the immediate abandonment of the terror system he created. His successors inherit a society so thoroughly conditioned by fear that immediate liberalization seems both impossible and dangerous, requiring gradual and careful dismantling of the apparatus of intimidation while maintaining sufficient control to prevent social chaos. The survival of the Soviet system for nearly 4 decades after Stalin's death testifies to the durability of the behavioral patterns and institutional structures he established. Stalin's legacy extends far beyond the specific context of Soviet history to influence understanding of how modern states can use systematic terror to control large populations. His innovations in mass surveillance, ideological manipulation, and psychological intimidation provide a model that subsequent authoritarian leaders study and adapt to their own circumstances, making his methods a permanent part of the toolkit available to those who seek absolute power over human societies. The ultimate measure of Stalin's success lies not in the specific policies he implemented or the particular enemies he destroyed, but in his demonstration that entire civilizations can be transformed through the systematic application of fear. The Soviet Union under Stalin proves that terror, when properly organized and sustained over sufficient time, can reshape human behavior at a fundamental level, creating populations that police themselves more effectively than any external force could achieve. The machinery of Stalin's post-war terror operates with clockwork precision, demonstrating how systematic fear can be institutionalized into the very fabric of society. The Ministry of State Security, reorganized from the NKVD in 1946, employs over 500,000 operatives whose daily work involves the meticulous documentation of Soviet citizens' lives, thoughts, and associations. Every workplace contains informants, every apartment building has designated watchers, and every social gathering includes individuals whose primary loyalty belongs to the state security apparatus, rather than to their apparent friends and colleagues. The sophistication of Stalin's surveillance network in his final years surpasses anything previously achieved in human history, creating a system where privacy becomes not just impractical, but conceptually meaningless. Citizens learn to conduct their most intimate conversations with the assumption that hostile ears are listening, leading to the development of elaborate codes and indirect communication methods that allow for the expression of dangerous thoughts without creating evidence that could be used in prosecution. Families develop signals to warn of approaching danger, while friends learn to communicate sensitive information through seemingly innocent discussions of weather, sports, or cultural events. The economic reconstruction of the Soviet Union after the war demonstrates both the strengths and fundamental contradictions of a system organized around fear. Massive construction projects are completed ahead of schedule because workers and managers are more terrified of Stalin than of industrial accidents or impossible deadlines. But the quality of construction suffers because admitting to problems or delays requires courage that few possess. The Moscow metro extensions, the rebuilding of Stalingrad, and the construction of new industrial centers in Siberia stand as monuments to what human beings can accomplish when motivated by absolute terror, but they also reveal the hidden costs of achievement built on systematic intimidation. The treatment of Soviet Jews during Stalin's final years reveals how his terror system can adapt existing prejudices to serve new political purposes. The establishment of Israel in 1948 provides Stalin with a pretext for questioning the loyalty of Soviet Jews, as their ethnic connection to the new state can be portrayed as evidence of divided loyalties. The anti-cosmopolitan campaign that follows represents not spontaneous anti-Semitism but carefully orchestrated persecution designed to eliminate Jewish influence in Soviet cultural and intellectual life, while demonstrating that no ethnic group enjoys protection from state power. Prominent Jewish artists, writers, scientists, and intellectuals find themselves systematically excluded from positions of influence through a process that maintains the facade of ideological rather than ethnic targeting. Jewish theaters are closed for promoting bourgeois nationalism. Jewish writers are condemned for rootless cosmopolitanism, and Jewish scientists face accusations of sharing state secrets with international Zionist organizations. The campaign serves multiple purposes in Stalin's terror system. It eliminates potential sources of independent thought, provides scapegoats for the regime's failures, and demonstrates that even previously favored groups can become enemies when political circumstances change. The Doctors, plot of 1950 to 1953, represents the culmination of Stalin's anti-Jewish campaign and demonstrates how medical care itself can become weaponized in service of political terror. 9 doctors, 6 of them Jewish, are accused of murdering high-ranking Soviet officials through deliberate malpractice while planning to assassinate Stalin himself. The accusations are so fantastic that they strain credibility even by the standards of previous show trials. But their very implausibility serves Stalin's purposes by demonstrating that citizens must accept whatever truth the state chooses to proclaim. The psychological impact of the Doctors' plot extends far beyond its immediate targets to affect the entire Soviet medical establishment. Physicians learn to avoid treating prominent patients who might die from natural causes, as death can be reinterpreted as evidence of sabotage regardless of the actual medical circumstances. Hospitals develop elaborate procedures for documenting every aspect of patient care to protect medical staff from subsequent accusations of deliberate harm. The terror system thus infiltrates even the most humanitarian professions, making healing itself a potentially dangerous activity when the patient holds political significance. Stalin's approach to managing the nuclear weapons program reveals how terror techniques can be adapted to handle the most sensitive state secrets while maintaining the scientific cooperation necessary for technological advancement. Nuclear scientists work under conditions of absolute isolation from the outside world, with their families held essentially as hostages to ensure continued loyalty. The city of Arzamas-16, where Soviet nuclear weapons are developed, operates as a closed community where every aspect of daily life is controlled by security services, from housing assignments to marriage permissions to recreational activities. The development of Soviet nuclear capabilities demonstrates that terror-based systems can achieve remarkable technological progress when properly organized, but only at enormous human costs that remain hidden from public view. Scientists who make critical contributions to nuclear weapons development receive substantial material rewards, but forfeit any possibility of normal human relationships or personal freedom. Their children grow up in a world where their father's work is simultaneously the source of their privileged status and the reason for their permanent imprisonment within the nuclear city's boundaries. The expansion of the Gulag system during Stalin's final years transforms forced labor from a method of punishment into a cornerstone of Soviet economic development. New camps are established in the Arctic regions to exploit mineral resources, in Central Asia to develop cotton production, and in Siberia to construct transportation infrastructure. The camps operate as slave labor enterprises that contribute significantly to Soviet industrial output while eliminating millions of potential opponents of the regime through deliberate neglect, overwork, and systematic brutality. Life in Stalin's Gulag represents the ultimate expression of terror as governance, creating communities where survival depends entirely on understanding and adapting to rules that prioritize political conformity over human welfare. Prisoners learn elaborate hierarchies of power and status that reflect the camp. Administrations need to maintain order among potentially rebellious populations. Informants among the inmates report on conversations and behaviors that might indicate continued opposition to Soviet authority, ensuring that political persecution continues even within the punishment system itself. The construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, the Moscow-Volga Canal, and other massive infrastructure projects demonstrates how Stalin's regime can mobilize hundreds of thousands of forced laborers for engineering achievements that would be impossible under normal economic conditions. These projects serve multiple purposes in the terror system. They eliminate political prisoners through deadly working conditions, create impressive symbols of Soviet engineering capabilities, and demonstrate the regime's ability to reshape the physical environment through the application of unlimited human resources. Religious communities face renewed persecution during Stalin's years as the wartime cooperation between church and state gives way to systematic efforts to eliminate religion as an independent source of authority. The Orthodox Church, which had supported Soviet resistance during World War II, finds its autonomy gradually eroded through the infiltration of clergy by security agents and the replacement of independent religious leaders with state-approved appointees. Believers learn to practice their faith with extreme caution, knowing that religious activities can be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty to socialist principles. The treatment of Muslim communities in Central Asia reveals how Stalin's terror system adapts to different cultural contexts while maintaining its essential characteristics of systematic intimidation. Islamic religious practices are gradually criminalized through laws that appear to target backward customs rather than religious belief itself. But the practical effect is to make the practice of Islam increasingly dangerous. Traditional Islamic education is replaced with state-controlled instruction that emphasizes socialist ideology over religious teachings, ensuring that future generations will be less capable of maintaining independent religious traditions. Cultural production in Stalin's final years becomes so thoroughly controlled that artistic creativity virtually disappears, replaced by mechanical reproduction of officially approved themes and styles. Writers learn to produce novels that celebrate industrial achievement and socialist construction while avoiding any content that might be interpreted as criticism of Soviet conditions. Composers create symphonies that incorporate folk melodies and revolutionary songs while eschewing any musical experimentation that might suggest bourgeois influences. The cumulative effect is to create a cultural environment that reinforces official ideology while eliminating any source of independent aesthetic experience. The education system becomes increasingly focused on ideological indoctrination at the expense of practical skills or intellectual development. Students learn to recite approved interpretations of history, literature, and science while avoiding any questions that might suggest independent thinking. Teachers who encourage curiosity or critical analysis face accusations of promoting anti-Soviet attitudes, while those who focus on rote memorization and ideological conformity receive recognition as model educators. The systematic suppression of intellectual curiosity serves Stalin's need for a compliant population, while ensuring that future generations will be less capable of challenging official authority. International communist parties serve as laboratories for testing how Stalin's terror techniques can be adapted to different national contexts while maintaining central control from Moscow. Local communist leaders who show excessive independence face recall to the Soviet Union and subsequent persecution, while those who demonstrate absolute obedience to Soviet direction receive support for implementing their own versions of Stalinist methods. The result is a network of satellite terror systems that operate according to local conditions while serving Moscow as strategic objectives. The development of nuclear weapons creates new categories of state secrets that require unprecedented levels of security, leading to the expansion of terror techniques to encompass entire scientific communities. Physicists, engineers, and technicians working on nuclear projects find themselves subject to constant surveillance and periodic interrogation. designed to detect any possible security breaches or unauthorized contacts with foreign scientists. The nuclear program thus becomes both a symbol of Soviet technological achievement and a demonstration of how terror can be used to manage the most sensitive aspects of state power. Stalin's personal paranoia during his final years reaches levels that threaten the functioning of the Soviet government itself, as his suspicion of potential rivals leads to the isolation of virtually all senior officials. Cabinet meetings become exercises in demonstrating loyalty rather than forums for policy discussion, while government ministers compete to avoid drawing Stalin's attention through any display of competence that might be interpreted as ambition. The aging dictator's psychological deterioration thus becomes a systemic problem that affects every aspect of Soviet governance. The planning for what appears to be a final massive purge in the months before Stalin's death suggests that his terror system had achieved a momentum, independent of rational political calculation. Evidence indicates that Stalin was preparing to eliminate most of the existing party and government leadership, including many officials who had served him loyally for decades. This projected purge would have served no obvious political purpose beyond satisfying Stalin's psychological needs, demonstrating how terror systems can become self-destructive when they lose connection to practical objectives. The death of Stalin on March 5, 1953, prevents the implementation of his final purge, but leaves his successors with the challenge of managing a society so thoroughly conditioned by fear that any sudden change might trigger social collapse. The immediate power struggle that follows demonstrates how completely Stalin's methods had shaped Soviet political culture, as potential successors compete not through appeals to different policies, but through their ability to control the security apparatus that had become the real foundation of Soviet power. The international impact of Stalin's terror system extends far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union to influence political development across multiple continents. Communist movements in China, North Korea, Vietnam, and other countries study Soviet methods and adapt them to local conditions, creating a global network of terror-based governments that collectively control the lives of hundreds of millions of people. The export of Stalinist techniques thus represents one of the most significant political developments of the 20th century, demonstrating how innovations in systematic oppression can transcend cultural and geographic boundaries. The ultimate legacy of Stalin's terror lies not in the specific institutions he created, but in his demonstration that modern technology and bureaucratic organization can be used to achieve levels of social control that were previously impossible in human history. His methods provide a template for authoritarian governance that remains relevant to contemporary discussions of state power, individual rights, and the relationship between security and freedom in modern societies. The story of how Stalin ruled the Soviet Union through fear reveals one of humanity's darkest chapters, but also one of its most important lessons about the fragility of human freedom and dignity under systematic oppression. Over nearly 3 decades, Stalin transformed a revolutionary society into a prison state where terror became the organizing principle of daily life, demonstrating how quickly civilized norms can dissolve when concentrated power meets unlimited ruthlessness. Stalin's innovations in governance through fear extended far beyond traditional authoritarian methods to create something unprecedented in human history. A society where the population learned to terrorize itself more effectively than any external force could achieve. By combining mass surveillance, ideological manipulation, systematic persecution, and psychological intimidation, he created a self-perpetuating system where survival depended on absolute conformity and independent thought became literally life-threatening. The human cost of Stalin's terror defies precise calculation, but conservative estimates suggest that his policies directly caused the deaths of at least 15 to 20 million Soviet citizens through execution, deportation, deliberate starvation, and forced labor. Millions more suffered imprisonment, torture, and psychological trauma that shaped their behavior for decades. Entire ethnic groups faced deportation or destruction, while professional classes were decimated through purges that eliminated expertise and experience across every sector of society. Perhaps more devastating than the immediate casualties was the long-term psychological impact on Soviet society. Stalin's terror created behavioral patterns that persisted long after his death. Habits of suspicion, self-censorship, and submission that made genuine democratic development extremely difficult. Citizens who survived his regime had learned to navigate life through careful calculation of political risks rather than honest expression of thoughts and feelings, creating a culture of fear that influenced Soviet behavior until the system's final collapse. The international implications of Stalin's methods extend far beyond Soviet borders, as his techniques for organizing systematic terror have been studied and adapted by authoritarian leaders worldwide. From Mao's China to Pol Pot's Cambodia, from Saddam Hussein's Iraq to modern surveillance states, elements of Stalin's approach to social control continue to influence how dictatorships maintain power in the contemporary world. Understanding Stalin's rule through terror remains crucial for recognizing the warning signs of authoritarian development and protecting democratic institutions from similar erosion. His success in transforming a society through fear demonstrates that civilized norms require active defense rather than passive assumption, and that the gradual erosion of individual rights can lead to catastrophic consequences if not resisted early and consistently. The ultimate lesson of Stalin's terror is that human societies are far more vulnerable to systematic manipulation than most people want to believe. Given sufficient time, organization, and ruthlessness, even the most basic human instincts for survival and family loyalty can be weaponized against the population itself, creating systems of oppression that operate through the victim's own cooperation rather than simple external force. Yet the eventual collapse of Stalin's system also demonstrates the ultimate unsustainability of governance based primarily on fear. While terror can maintain political control for extended periods, it cannot generate the creativity, innovation, and voluntary cooperation necessary for long-term social and economic development. The Soviet Union's eventual failure suggests that societies organized around fear contain the seeds of their own destruction, even when that destruction takes decades to manifest. The millions who died under Stalin's terror deserve remembrance not just as statistics, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by a system that treated human beings as expendable resources in the pursuit of absolute power. Their suffering serves as a permanent warning about the consequences of allowing any leader or ideology to claim authority over the fundamental rights and dignity of human beings.